It began not with a formal announcement, but with a series of frantic, encrypted communications that bypassed every standard royal channel. While the world slept, believing the British monarchy was slowly stabilizing, a shocking leak from a high-level source within the Home Office triggered an unprecedented reaction from King Charles himself. This wasn't a routine security update. It was a report indicating that Prince Harry had not only planned a secret return to London, but had already initiated legal and logistical maneuvers that threatened to bypass the king's authority. Within minutes, the command was issued: a total palace lockdown, unauthorized by the typical advisory committees and ordered directly by the sovereign. The atmosphere inside the palace shifted from calculated silence to a state of internal dread. Lights flickered in the king's private study long before dawn, as senior aides were summoned under lifelong oaths of secrecy to contain what many are now calling the return crisis. This was the moment the system reached its breaking point. The king, usually a man of traditional patience, reportedly chose to drop the mask of family diplomacy, realizing that the woman who holds the emotional center of his heart and the stability of the institution was being placed at risk by another wave of public scandal. Observers noticed a visible shift in the king's demeanor. When he finally appeared for a private briefing, the physical signs of the burden were undeniable. Deep-set wrinkles and a hardened gaze spoke of a man who was no longer managing a family disagreement, but a constitutional threat. Every inch of his expression told a story of a system trying to control a reality that was rapidly spiraling out of its grasp. The lockdown was not just about physical gates. It was an emotional and informational seal meant to protect the crown from a truth that was being dragged out at the last possible moment. This first layer of the crisis reveals a fundamental problem. When an ancient institution depends on the humanization of its members, a sudden, unwanted return acts as a toxic catalyst. As the king remained awake, reviewing summaries that contradicted every previous assurance of privacy and distance, one haunting realization set in. The monarchy wasn't just managing optics anymore. It was fighting for its survival against a leak that originated from the very heart of its IT network, a betrayal that changed everything for the crown. The information leak did not stop at a simple notification of return. It carried with it a dense, highly classified file known among inner palace circles as the Harry Dossier. This document contains a chillingly detailed map of legal and logistical maneuvers prepared months in advance, proving that this was never a spontaneous visit for reconciliation. Instead, it was a cold, calculated move to reposition the Duke's status within the royal framework. When this file was dragged into the light, it triggered a red alert because it exposed the deep structural cracks in the monarchy's information security. A system that prides itself on being impenetrable, but was now laid bare by one of its own. While the public might view Harry as a son seeking his roots, royal analysts behind closed doors see a far more complex insight. The dossier reveals that Harry isn't just seeking security, he is demanding a formal, institutional validation of his role, something the crown has fiercely resisted since the fallout of Megxit. His return, if left unmanaged, acts as a distorted mirror, reflecting the palace's own PR failures. It forces the institution to confront a reality it has spent years trying to suppress, that they no longer hold the monopoly on the royal narrative. The dossier is not just a collection of papers, it is a declaration of intent that challenges the very foundation of the king's current reign. King Charles now faces a brutal emotional kill zone. As a father, he feels the ancestral pull of family, but as a sovereign, he must act with the cold precision of a statesman. He is trapped between the desire to heal his family and the duty to protect his heir, Prince William, who reportedly views this return as a direct existential threat to the future stability of the throne. The metaphors used in palace communications are no longer about unity or warmth. They have shifted to the language of containment. The silence coming from the palace is not peaceful, it is thunderous silence, a strategic blackout designed to mask the internal panic as they realize the Harry Dossier has already bypassed their primary defenses. The king's decision to order a lockdown is the ultimate attempt to protect the perception of control. However, Much like an ancient estate with crumbling foundations, hanging beautiful portraits cannot hide the fact that the internal structure is under unbearable pressure. Every line leaked from this secret dossier is not merely personal gossip. It is a high-stakes test of a centuries-old institution's ability to survive the transparency demands of the 21st century. The king knows that in this digital age, once the mask has dropped, the crown cannot afford to blink. As the palace lockdown intensified, a secondary and perhaps more dangerous fracture began to form. The direct confrontation between King Charles and his heir, Prince William. While the king was driven by a desperate need to contain the leak and preserve the institution's dignity, William reportedly viewed the situation through a lens of raw betrayal. For William, the Harry Dossier wasn't just a political headache. It was a personal assault on the stability he has spent years building. Insiders describe a hushed but heated exchange in the private apartments, where the sound of raised voices echoed through the centuries-old stone corridors, a rare breach of royal decorum that signaled a house divided against itself. The psychological insight here is profound. William, long conditioned to be the ultimate protector of the crown's future, found himself in a kill zone of loyalty. He demanded to know how such a significant breach could happen under the king's watch, questioning the very security apparatus that Charles had just locked down. William's stance was clear. There should be no negotiation, no half-in, half-out reconciliation, and certainly no institutional validation for someone who had already stepped away. This created a structural tension within the monarchy, a clash between the king's desire for a quiet legacy and the prince's demand for a firm, unyielding boundary. In this high-stakes power play, the metaphors have shifted from family dynamics to territorial defense. William reportedly feels that the king's lockdown is a reactive measure, whereas he advocates for a proactive, permanent separation of narratives. He sees the Harry Dossier as a weaponized truth, designed to destabilize his own eventual reign. The atmosphere became so toxic that senior aides reported a chilling stillness in the room after William allegedly told his father that protecting the institution sometimes means cutting ties that no longer serve the bloodline. It was a moment where the ink of constitutional duty took precedence over the blood of family connection. The king, trapped between his two sons, is now facing his greatest moral and political test. He knows that siding too heavily with William risks being seen as a cold, heartless monarch, but ignoring William's concerns could lead to an internal abdication of trust from the man who must one day wear the crown. This fracture is the hidden bomb within the lockdown. Every hour, the palace remains sealed. The distance between the king and the prince grows, proving that the greatest threat to the monarchy isn't the leak from the outside, but the irreconcilable differences brewing at its very core. The crown is no longer just fighting a PR war. It is fighting to decide whose version of the future will survive. As the internal war between King Charles and Prince William reached a stalemate, a new power center emerged from the silence: Princess Anne. Known for her stoic pragmatism and unyielding loyalty to the late Queen's legacy, Anne reportedly chose this moment to step out of the shadows and confront the king directly. Her intervention was not a soft plea for family unity. It was a surgical strike against the current state of panic. She demanded a private audience with Charles, setting a chilling condition that sent shockwaves through the staff. Queen Camilla was not to be present. This move wasn't just a slight against Camilla. It was a clear signal that Anne believed the Harry Dossier crisis was being mishandled by those closest to the king's ear. The insight here is that Anne represents the constitutional anchor. While Charles reacts with the fear of a man seeing his legacy crumble, and William reacts with the defensive fury of a future king, Anne views the lockdown through the lens of cold institutional survival. She reportedly reminded Charles of a secret vow made to their mother: to protect the children of the monarchy not just as heirs, but as human beings who carry the weight of the crown's soul. To Anne, the lockdown and the DNA investigations were cruel and unnecessary, a sign of a monarchy that has lost its moral compass in a desperate bid for control. She warned Charles that by trying to seal the truth, he was instead creating a vacuum that the shadow forces were more than happy to fill. And it is within this vacuum that a third, more mysterious power, began to operate a rogue element known only by the digital signature, the Keeper. While the palace gates were physically locked, a different kind of breach was happening in the digital ether. Information from the Harry Dossier wasn't just leaking, it was being curated and released with precision timing to maximize internal friction. Anne's own private investigation revealed a disturbing truth. The leak originated from within the royal IT network, specifically from a terminal linked to the Queen's inner circle. This suggests that the Shadow isn't an external enemy, but a faction within the palace, using Harry's return as a smokescreen to reorganize the power structure of the monarchy itself. Anne's presence has changed the internal tide. She has become the rallying point for senior aides, who felt the king's reaction was too extreme. By siding with Catherine's maternal instincts over Charles's institutional paranoia, Anne has effectively created a buffer zone that prevents the monarchy from tearing itself apart, at least for now. However, the threat of the Keeper remains. The Princess Royal knows that a house that cannot trust its own shadows is a house that is already falling. The question shifted from, "Why is Harry returning?" to "Who is using Harry to destroy the king?" As the fourth part of this crisis unfolds, the lockdown has become a prison not for the truth, but for the king himself. The palace lockdown was intended to stop the leak, but it failed to account for a truth that was already vibrating through the digital walls. As the king's cybersecurity team scrubbed the metadata of the encrypted emails sent to the press, the investigation narrowed down to a single, devastating point of origin: a terminal located within the private offices of Queen Camilla's senior staff. This was the moment the crisis ceased to be a mere family dispute and became a direct, internal betrayal. The revelation sent King Charles into a state of paralyzed disbelief. The person he trusted most to navigate the storms of public opinion, his own wife, was now inextricably linked to the source of the monarchy's greatest modern threat. The psychological insight of this betrayal is agonizing. For Charles, Camilla has always been his non-negotiable support system, the one person for whom he sacrificed his public standing and family peace. To discover that the Harry Dossier was weaponized from within her inner circle suggests one of two chilling possibilities. Either the Queen was unaware of a high-level rogue operative in her midst, or she was playing a far more dangerous game of institutional survival than anyone realized. Sources whisper that Camilla's advice to Charles to neutralize the threat of Harry's return may have been a calculated move to redirect public suspicion, a classic palace maneuver to cast shadows where the light of truth was getting too bright. While this private war raged within the apartments, the external pressure reached a fever pitch. Outside the locked gates, the Keeper continued to feed the global media snippets of Prince Harry's legal demands, creating a narrative of a monarchy in hiding. This isn't just a PR nightmare. It is a constitutional emergency. Members of Parliament began asking pointed questions about the king's ability to maintain order within his own household. If a sovereign cannot control his own computer networks and his own family members, can he be trusted with the symbolic stability of a nation? The lockdown had become a public admission of weakness, a visual metaphor for a crown that is no longer in control of its own story. The atmosphere between Charles and Camilla has reportedly turned from unified to icy. The king, driven by a duty to the ink of succession, found himself questioning the blood of his marriage. Princess Anne's earlier warning about losing his soul began to haunt him. In this part of the storm, the institution is forced to confront its most uncomfortable secret: that the greatest threat to its continuity is not the rebellious son in California, but the bitter rivalries and survival instincts of those who sit closest to the throne. As the king prepared for an emergency briefing that he could no longer delay, the Camilla factor became the variable that threatened to blow the entire royal house apart. The silence in the palace is no longer a shield, it is the sound of a foundation cracking under the weight of an unbearable truth. As the palace lockdown tightened its grip, a third, and perhaps more devastating war, erupted behind the closed doors of Clarence House. This was not a battle between the crown and a rebellious son, but a direct, visceral confrontation between King Charles and the woman he had spent a lifetime protecting, Queen Camilla. When the cybersecurity team presented irrefutable evidence that the access codes used by the keeper were linked to a device within her private office, Charles's foundation of trust was dealt a fatal blow. This was no longer just a security breach. It was an existential betrayal at the very heart of his private world. In an emergency meeting stripped of all aides and advisors, Charles reportedly faced Camilla with a coldness that stunned those who caught a glimpse of his departure. His eyes, usually filled with a desperate warmth for her, were now hollowed by suspicion. The psychological insight here is harrowing. The king was forced to ask a question that threatened to dismantle his entire personal history. Was she so eager to solidify her own legacy that she was willing to use Harry's return as a media sacrificial lamb, only to inadvertently nurture a traitor within her own inner circle? The king was no longer looking at his wife. He was looking at a potential liability to the crown's survival. Camilla, ever the master of palace survival, reportedly chose a sharp defensive strategy. She maintained that she, too, was a victim of a sophisticated conspiracy designed to fracture the royal unity. However, the emotional kill zone for Charles was already triggered. He began to wonder if his decades of unwavering support for her had been a strategic blindness. The silence that filled the room after Charles ordered the immediate suspension of her entire senior staff, effectively stripping her wings within her own home, was described by insiders as a death knell for their unified front. This fracture marks a historic turning point. The unity between Charles and Camilla, which had been the bedrock of the new reign's stability, is gone. While the palace maintains a calm exterior under the lockdown, the internal power structure has been shattered. Charles has realized that when trust is lost, even the thickest stone walls of Buckingham cannot provide sanctuary. This is where the keeper achieved the ultimate victory, not by revealing secrets about Harry, but by destroying the final bond that kept the king from absolute isolation on his throne. The lockdown is no longer protecting the family. It is merely containing the ruins of a broken trust. As the physical lockdown of the palace entered its second week, a different kind of barrier was erected, a wall of absolute legal silence. King Charles, driven by the realization that his inner circle had been compromised, initiated what insiders are calling the Great Royal Purge. This was not a series of standard HR terminations. These were secret sanctions designed to surgically remove anyone associated with the leak. Under the king's direct order, the most senior aides within Queen Camilla's office, those who had held keys to the monarchy's digital kingdom for decades, were not just dismissed. They were professionally erased. The psychological insight of this phase is the weaponization of the Non-Disclosure Agreement, NDA. In the world of the British monarchy, an NDA is more than a contract. It is a life sentence of silence. Reports suggest that these aides were forced to sign Tier 1 gag orders, the most restrictive in the constitutional framework, preventing them from speaking even to their own families about the events of the Harry Dossier. The emotional kill zone here is the total loss of identity. One day, these individuals were at the pinnacle of global influence. The next, they became ghosts in the system, their access cards deactivated and their names scrubbed from the palace directory. This move proves that when the crown feels an existential threat, it does not negotiate, it annihilates the source of the friction. But the most disturbing development is the disappearance of key witnesses. Specifically, the senior aide whose digital signature was linked to the initial leak has reportedly vanished from the public eye. There were no resignation announcements, no moving on to new ventures statements. One former staffer whispered that the aide's private residence was vacated within hours, with no forwarding address. This isn't just a security measure, it is a strategic blackout. By vanishing the witnesses, the palace is attempting to reset the narrative, hoping that if the people behind the leak no longer exist in the public sphere, the leak itself will eventually be dismissed as a conspiracy theory. Princess Anne reportedly viewed these extreme sanctions with a mixture of grim necessity and moral dread. She knows that a monarchy that hides its mistakes by erasing its people is a monarchy that is slowly rotting from within. The ink of the law is being used to cover the blood of the betrayal. As the seventh part of this crisis reaches its peak, the palace staff is paralyzed by fear. Every conversation is monitored, every digital footprint is tracked. The king has succeeded in stopping the leak, but at a cost that may be too high to pay. He has turned his sanctuary into a prison. The question is no longer what Harry wants, but how many people the king is willing to sacrifice to keep the Louis dossier and the Harry return from merging into a singular, throne-shattering truth. While the king succeeded in silencing his staff and isolating his wife within the palace walls, he failed to account for the one force even a sovereign cannot ignore: the international stage. As the lockdown entered its third week, the crisis spilled over the borders of the United Kingdom and into the heart of the Commonwealth. Leaders from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand nations, where the king serves as the formal head of state, reportedly initiated a series of Grey Channel communications. These were not the usual diplomatic pleasantries. They were urgent, cold, and constitutionally sharp demands for the truth regarding the Harry dossier and the legitimacy of the succession line. The psychological insight here is the fragility of the global crown. The Commonwealth is held together by a thread of shared tradition and the perceived integrity of the royal bloodline. If the Harry dossier suggests that the monarchy is willing to hide fundamental truths or manipulate succession for the sake of PR stability, the very foundation of the Commonwealth begins to dissolve. For leaders in Canberra or Ottawa, the palace lockdown wasn't seen as a private family matter. It was viewed as a lack of transparency that threatened their own constitutional order. The emotional kill zone for King Charles moved from his private study to the global map. He realized that a king who cannot provide a clear, honest account of his heirs is a king who may soon lose 15 realms. In an unprecedented move, a joint confidential inquiry was reportedly submitted by a coalition of Commonwealth High Commissioners. They demanded a briefing on the Louis dossier and the true nature of Harry's return. This put the king in an impossible corner. To provide the information would be to admit that the keeper was right, that the palace had been lying. To refuse would be to trigger a series of constitutional reviews that could lead to the formal removal of the monarchy as head of state in several key nations. The metaphors of the palace have changed again. It is no longer just a prison or a fortress. It has become a sinking ship on the high seas of international politics. The atmosphere in the palace briefing rooms turned from fearful to desperate. Senior diplomats warned the king that the lockdown was now his greatest liability. By choosing silence, he had invited suspicion from the very people who uphold his global authority. Princess Anne reportedly observed this shift with a grim sense of, "I told you so." She knows that the crown is a symbolic contract with the people, and once the people and their leaders stop believing in the integrity of the symbol, the contract is void. As the eighth part of this crisis unfolds, the king is no longer just fighting a leak or a wife. He is fighting a global rebellion of the mind. The Commonwealth's demand for transparency has become the loud, insistent heartbeat that the palace walls can no longer muffle. The crown is at the edge of a precipice, and the next leak won't just break a heart, it will break an empire. The silence that King Charles had fought so desperately to maintain was finally and irreversibly shattered at 4 a.m. While the physical gates of Buckingham Palace remained barred and the elite security teams patrolled the perimeter, the digital fortifications suffered a total systemic collapse. The Keeper, the rogue shadow force operating from within the royal network, chose this moment to release the endgame, the full 400-page unredacted Harry dossier. This was no longer a series of strategic leaks or cryptic hints. It was a massive dump of raw data, legal documents, and private correspondences that laid bare every secret the monarchy had attempted to bury for decades. The psychological insight of this moment is the absolute death of the perception of control. In the modern era, a monarchy's power is derived from its ability to curate its own mystery. Once the unredacted truth is available for public download, the mystery is replaced by a cold, clinical reality. The dossier revealed not only Prince Harry's strategic maneuvers, but also the king's own handwritten directives to neutralize the narrative at any cost. It contained the transcripts of the heated arguments between Charles and William, and most devastatingly, the forensic evidence of the inner circle's betrayal. The emotional kill zone here is the king's realization that his lockdown didn't protect the crown. It merely turned it into a target. He had built a wall of stone against an enemy made of light and data. The reaction inside the palace was one of total, paralyzed horror. Senior aides, who had spent their entire careers upholding the sanctity of the royal brand, watched in real time as the most searched terms globally shifted from royal lockdown to the unredacted dossier. The metaphors of the monarchy, the fortress, the sanctuary, the eternal line were replaced by the imagery of a breached vessel. The lockdown, far from being a sign of strength, was now mocked as a desperate act of an institution that had lost touch with the transparency of the 21st century. The king, reportedly found sitting in his study staring at a dark screen, had finally run out of secrets. Princess Anne's earlier warning reached its tragic fulfillment. By choosing to hide the truth, the king had allowed the keeper to become the ultimate arbiter of history. The public was no longer listening to the palace press office. They were reading the raw files themselves. This is the ultimate existential crisis for a constitutional monarchy, when the people possess more information about the sovereign's private motives than the sovereign himself can control. As the ninth part of this nightmare concludes, the lockdown is no longer necessary, for there is nothing left to hide. The king has preserved his throne, but he has lost the narrative, and in the modern world, the narrative is the throne. The final part of the crisis is no longer about the return of a prince. It is about the survival of the king's soul in the aftermath of a digital execution. The palace lockdown has finally been lifted, but the iron gates of Buckingham no longer offer the same sense of sanctuary. As the world looks on, they no longer see an impenetrable fortress of tradition, but a structural ruin exposed by the brutal light of data and betrayal. The reign of King Charles III has passed a point of no return. The release of the full, unredacted Harry Dossier by the keeper has turned the royal mystery into a public commodity, where every calculation, every pain, and every manipulation is dissected under the global microscope. The crown has survived the storm, but it has emerged into a reality where its primary weapon, secrecy, has been neutralized. The price of the lockdown and the weeks of silence is the total collapse of the perception of control. For centuries, the strength of the British monarchy lay in its ability to curate what the public was allowed to know. But now, with every sensitive recording and private confrontation in the hands of millions, the king is no longer the narrator of his own story. He is merely a character in a script he can no longer edit. The chilling insight here is that in the era of digital transparency, an institution that lives by secrets is an institution that builds its own prison. The monarchy did not just lose a digital war. It lost the ability to define its own truth. The future of the House of Windsor now faces a new sentence: existence within a glass monarchy. Every move by Prince William, every decision by Queen Camilla, and every decree by the king will be cross-referenced against the leaked files. Trust cannot be restored with staged photographs or hollow press releases. It requires a total restructuring of institutional honesty, something the Crown has never been prepared to offer. The Harry Dossier earthquake has proven that the greatest threat to the throne is not external rebellion, but the stubborn adherence to archaic standards in a world that has moved on. The legacy of the House of Windsor is no longer a symbol of eternity, but a reminder of the fragility of power in the face of the unvarnished truth. King Charles, reportedly retreating into the cold solitude of Sandringham, now faces the ultimate emotional kill zone: isolation at the pinnacle of power. He has preserved the crown, but the cost has been a shattered bond with his sons, a deep-seated suspicion of his wife, and the loss of trust from his heirs. Princess Anne remains as the final custodian of the royal conscience, but even she knows that once the mask has dropped, it can never be worn the same way again. The lockdown is over, but the shadows it created will linger for generations. The question is no longer what the keeper will do next, but whether the monarchy has the courage to reinvent itself from the ashes of this transparency, or if it will continue to fade into the very darkness it tried so hard to hide.